Welcome back to our session on faith and reason. In our introductory lesson, we saw how this theme is of contemporary relevance, how many of the debates of our age revolve around this apparent conflict between the two. We saw how a thinker like psychologist Steven Pinker considers faith as merely the assent or belief without good evidence. We also saw how Jean Twenge, another psychologist, has studied the generational trends of the day and sees that this current generation, the so-called iGen, is the least religious generation in American history. And that one of the chief reasons for this lack of religious progress is because of the apparent conflict, the apparent contradiction between science, with all of its great breakthroughs, and antiquated religion, with its tendency to repress or suppress. So now we have the opportunity, after having reflected upon the great work of Raphael, to take a more positive look at the relationship and harmony between faith and reason. In Raphael's masterpiece, we saw how in one room, in this great room of the signature, where Pope Julius II would gather with others, that we have the unity of all disciplines, including the unity of math, science, philosophy, with the great truths of divine revelation. Now it's time to go deeper. Now it's time to build on solid ground. And to do so, I would like to devote our second session to an in-depth analysis and reflection upon Pope Benedict XVI's words on the figure of St. Thomas Aquinas. As some of you may know, the Pope devoted many years to explaining to the Christian faithful the great church fathers and doctors of the church, these great men and women of the faith who helped to explain and defend the treasures of Christianity. And along the way of this great classroom, this great explanation, Pope Benedict decided to devote 3 whole lessons, 3 weeks, to analyzing the figure of Thomas Aquinas. No doubt because the Holy Father considered that Aquinas was of particular importance and particular relevance to the issues of the day. Here we see an image of the great saint. He's writing one of his renowned religious hymns, and he's receiving, if you will, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, the image of the dove coming down upon him. Now, the Holy Father, Pope Benedict, would refer often to Thomas Aquinas' new synthesis of faith and reason and the distinction that he made between faith and reason. And we'll see the importance of both of these elements during our in-depth analysis of the Holy Father's address. We see first that Thomas Aquinas, to this day, is recommended as a model thinker. In the Second Vatican Council, which has shaped the direction of the contemporary church, Thomas Aquinas' thought was again recommended in the council document on the training of priests. So practically all seminarians around the world are expected to have some familiarity with this great figure. But Thomas Aquinas was not only recommended for the men in black, he was also recommended to all of the Christian faithful. Therefore, his thought also emerges in the council document on Christian education. And we're reminded that Pope Leo XIII saw fit to declare Thomas Aquinas patron of Catholic schools and universities at the end of the 19th century. So again, he is a model for all of us. And he's a model, one, because of the content of his teaching, because he managed to explore practically all of the major themes of philosophy and theology, and to write about these themes with a unique depth and with a unique capacity for synthesis. Many have experienced that there are gems of wisdom contained in practically every paragraph, practically every sentence of the great thinker. But Thomas Aquinas is recommended not only for the content of his teaching. He's recommended as well for his methodology. And here we see, again, this theme of synthesis and distinction. So throughout, we'll see the way in which even when we may disagree with a particular conclusion that Thomas makes, we can still learn much from his approach and his capacity to bring together faith and reason, while respecting the unique contributions of each of the fields. Now, before discussing Thomas Aquinas in particular, the Holy Father wisely places the great thinker and model of faith and reason in a larger context of Christian engagement with these themes. Early on in the history of Christian thought, Platonic philosophy proved to be uniquely fruitful. So for the fathers of the church, for the early Christian thinkers, in particular for the great genius, St. Augustine, Plato offered this vision of the world, this systematic understanding of different realities that the Christians could draw upon in expressing their faith in a language that others would understand better. So we see that Platonic philosophy presented an understanding of the world, a certain cosmology. It presented an understanding of the meaning of human life, which included an ethical doctrine, a way of behavior. It also included this great reflection on God, on this highest principle, on the good. And it introduced themes of religion. Plato himself, Socrates in his dialogues, is deeply concerned with religious thought and never thought that being a philosopher necessarily entailed being a secularist or someone unconcerned with questions of religious faith. So we see how a complete vision is provided of the world, of God, of human life, drawing upon the rich treasure of a system of thought that developed well before the coming of Christ. But this system is always constructed in the light of faith. So the fathers of the church are not trying to simply present their own school of thinking. They're not looking for their own personal disciples. Rather, they're looking to take that common treasure of divine revelation offered to all men and present it in a new light, more clearly, more persuasively to their contemporaries. Now, we have a new development in the time of Thomas Aquinas. Here there's a revival, a recovery of the thought and great work of Aristotle, who we already discussed very briefly in our analysis of the School of Athens in Raphael's masterful painting. Aristotle's thought offers really a new perspective, a new approach to understanding the world, and it did create quite a bit of controversy in the day. Many thinkers of the time were presenting Aristotle as though he were a rival to Christianity, a new system that could replace what people in the Middle Ages already considered an outdated faith. Here we have a philosophy that makes no reference to divine revelation, a system of thought that depends solely upon reason. So the question began to arise. Are the world of rationality, philosophy conceived of without Christ, and the world of faith compatible? Or are they mutually exclusive? Do we need to make a choice between one or the other? Again, it's difficult for us to imagine because we tend to associate Aristotle with, you could say, a traditional approach or a very conservative mindset. But with the rediscovery of his work, there was a revolution in the universities. And many wanted to ban or limit students' access to this apparently dangerous thinker, who again was offering a complete worldview that might provide an alternative to Christianity. For instance, there were some who argued that Aristotle was presenting a single intellect for all men, or that he was presenting an eternal universe with no beginning. So these truths seem to clash radically with Christianity. So if reason alone, in the greatest thinker, could lead us to these conclusions, for instance, to eternal universe, how could we reasonably then assert through faith that there was a creator, there was a beginning? It looked like Genesis was out of date, that Genesis was false. So the debate that rages around the apparent conflict between Darwinian evolution and a fundamentalist reading of the book of Genesis shows us that this conflict actually dates back to a much earlier period. And so Aristotle seemed to present an alternative reading and vision. But one of the great insights of Aquinas and other thinkers that follow him is to see that philosophy without Christ is still valuable, that there are still tremendous insights that can be achieved through the gift of natural reason alone. Perhaps some of you have had the opportunity to read the great poetic masterpiece, The Divine Comedy by Dante. And you might notice that early on, before Dante takes his harrowing journey through the pits of hell and encounters the various suffering souls, he comes upon the limbo state. He comes upon souls who did not know Christ because they existed long before the coming of Christ and therefore could not benefit, according to Dante, from the full fruits of divine revelation and could not be admitted to heaven, but who displayed great virtue, great insight, and therefore did not merit a place in hell, did not merit eternal damnation. Therefore, they existed in a state of natural happiness, a state of limbo. And there, this encounter gives Dante the opportunity to encounter the noble pagans, to show praise and respect for the great contribution of those thinkers who existed long before the light of Christ. So for the longest time, the Catholic tradition has had a certain reverence and respect for the capacity of human reason to reach certain truths even without the light of revelation. Yet at the same time, Thomas Aquinas and the Catholic tradition would recognize this incompleteness to philosophy, that philosophy can bring us to great insights, but it is awaiting the light of Christ. John Paul II never tired of repeating a beautiful passage from the Second Vatican Council, the document Gaudium et Spes, number 22, where he spoke of how only in the light of Christ does the full mystery of man receive full illumination. So only in the light of Christ does the mystery of man receive its full illumination. And only in the light of Christ can man realize fully his noble calling, his noble vocation. So philosophy can bring us quite far, but it longs for, in a sense, points toward the full illumination and light of Christ. But again, it's not an either or. It's a both and. It's a matter of completing that which human reason alone cannot reach. So we see very clearly in the system of Thomas Aquinas and his reflection an independence of philosophy and theology. Perhaps early on in the history of the Church, there wasn't so clear a distinction. The thinkers were concerned about drawing upon the richness of Platonic thought and applying that to their biblical reflections. But now Thomas Aquinas is faced with the system of Aristotle, he's faced with rival schools of thought, and he wants on the one hand to respect the accomplishments of philosophy, and on the other hand, respect the discipline and the science of theology. But, of course, Thomas wants us to also appreciate the reciprocal relation between the two, that they should enrich one another, and there's no need to set one aside to pursue the other. And so Thomas Aquinas provides for us, even to this day, a great guide in the ongoing dialogue between the two. And Thomas Aquinas was truly a man of dialogue. Even if he didn't have the opportunity to travel to see all of the great thinkers of his time, he was in constant dialogue through his writings. Perhaps some of you have had the chance to read a bit from his famous Summa Theologiae. There he's entering into a dialogue and debate, and he always seeks to present the best objections to his own position. And after he makes the best case possible for the opposing position, he explains himself, but always making sure to highlight what is good and true and valuable in the other. So he doesn't want to set up a straw man that he can then easily knock aside. He doesn't want to simply mock his opponent or assume that because his opponent doesn't have the complete picture, he must therefore be in error about everything. No, rather, Thomas is a man of dialogue. He always seeks first the good and true in the other before then correcting and guiding that position toward its fullness. And he can provide for us, even to this day, a great model in our own philosophical dialogue, in ecumenical relations, in perhaps interreligious dialogue, etc. And for Thomas, it's clear that faith consolidates, integrates, and illuminates the heritage of truth that human reason acquires. So all that is good and valuable in Aristotle or Plato or any of these other thinkers can and should be incorporated into this larger Catholic worldview. And at the root of this compatibility, of this unity, is a common origin. So Thomas is very much aware that these truths of reason from the great philosophers and these truths of divine revelation that we read about in the Old and New Testament stem from the same logos, from the same word, from that same rationality at the source of all that is intelligible to us. So we do not have an arbitrary God. We do not have an irrational God. We do not have a voluntaristic God who simply imposes his will upon us so that we as sorts of slaves follow his every whim and fancy. No, we have a rational God, an intelligent God who has an order and purpose in the universe, who gives our own lives a certain order and structure, and who invites us to use our own rationality to better appreciate the intelligibility of the world and of his own words to us. So we see that in Thomas, reason receives a truth by reason of its intrinsic evidence, mediated or unmediated. So that may seem a little bit dense, but really here, what the Holy Father wants to do is express Thomas's understanding of the right and just autonomy of reason. That reason, philosophy understood as an autonomous discipline, as practiced by someone like Aristotle, does not depend upon the Bible. So its truths, its fundamental starting points, do not depend upon a prior commitment to any particular Christian religion. Faith accepts a truth on the basis of the authority of the Word of God that is revealed. So this is important, and we'll see as we continue. Faith opens up new horizons, new perspectives, new insights, new truths, new realities that even the greatest of philosophers were not able to attain through the use of their reason alone. But remember, it's always based on this fundamental trust and humble acceptance of a revelation from God. God who is ultimately trustworthy beyond any doubt, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. So we're not so much talking here in St. Thomas Aquinas' thought, of some sort of irrational leap of faith, of some sort of will to believe in the phrase of William James. No, it's not simply that, well, we'd like religion to be true or we'd like the church to be true. It's not a mere wish fulfillment, but rather it's the reasonable acceptance of divine authority, of that one who can neither deceive nor be deceived. The humble trust in the one who can open up these new horizons to our thought. So here we have the words of Thomas Aquinas himself to help make this distinction all the more clear. We must bear in mind that there are two kinds of sciences. There are some which proceed from a principle known by the natural light of intelligence, such as arithmetic, geometry, and the like. So here we see that there are fields of thought that do not depend upon religion, that any serious student can conclude to. There's really no Catholic arithmetic. There's no Catholic geometry. These are truths that are accessible to all men who follow rightly these natural principles that reason alone reveals. But Thomas goes on to complete the picture. There are some which proceed, some sciences, from principles known by the light of a higher science. Thus, the science of perspective proceeds from principles established by geometry, and music from principles established from arithmetic. So we notice that some fields of thought depend on other fields of thought and accept these principles that are gained from these other fields. So Thomas makes an interesting connection here. He says, so it is that sacred doctrine is a science, because it proceeds from principles established by the light of a higher science, namely the science of God and the blessed. Now, I think a lot of us, perhaps even those of us who have had some sort of religious formation in the past, might be a bit surprised by how insistent Thomas Aquinas is when he declares sacred doctrine or theology a science. Right? When we hear science, we tend to think of chemistry, of biology, of botany, etc. We think of the empirical. We think of the scientific method. We think of experiments, of tests, of hypotheses. And while it's true that these are sciences, we have to enter into a broader perspective, a broader vision that Thomas is introducing us to as part of the entire classical tradition. Something that he learned from Aristotle and the other great philosophers long before the coming of Christ. It's that science here is understood fundamentally as this organized body of knowledge that's based upon firm principles of thought. And so this organized body of knowledge brings us to conclusions through the understanding of causes. So we take a look at cause and effect to come to certain conclusions based upon fundamental principles. So even though sacred doctrine does not involve laboratory tests, it takes nothing away from the fact that it's coming to certain conclusions through knowledge of causes in an organized, systematic manner. And Thomas notes that this science that we practice of sacred doctrine, of theology, is ultimately dependent upon and giving us some share in the very science or knowledge of God and the blessed. So I think we're brought back to this beautiful image of Raphael, of this image of the disputation of the Eucharist, where what happens on earth brings us up into heaven. And so we see through the light of faith, we're not blinding ourselves to the natural evidence. Rather, we're opening our eyes into an entire new perspective. We're given something, some small share in the knowledge, the science of God and the blessed. So it's an expansion, an extension of our knowledge that does nothing to negate what we've gained through our other studies, through our other sciences. So again, the discipline reflection upon these truths that are given to us and revealed to us brings to us a systematic, organized body of knowledge through causes. It doesn't bring us to simply passivity or to think that, well, God said it in the Bible, therefore I really don't need to reflect further. Rather, our hunger and our desire for an ever greater knowledge and an ever greater love of the one who's revealed himself impels us to this rational pursuit of sacred doctrine. So again, we see that Thomas respects fully the autonomy of the two sciences. And he actually has very harsh words for those who would misuse philosophy to make bad arguments in favor of the faith. He says this is a disgrace, that it's better to make no argument than to misuse and manipulate philosophy to try to come up with some sort of apparent theological or religious conclusion. No. We should respect the uniqueness of each science. We see that the two go together well, that they benefit each other. There's reciprocal collaboration and not separation. We also see that in Thomas's mind, faith protects reason from distrust in its own abilities and stimulates it to be open to ever broader horizons. So anyone who's pursued, say, the philosophical sciences or has tried to engage in these serious pursuits of wisdom through reason alone, almost immediately comes up with the dizzying array of contrary opinions, of schools of thought, and comes up clearly with the immense difficulties involved in trying to come up with clarity on these fields. So when we pursue philosophical themes that continue to fascinate the people of every age, we sometimes run up to the limits of reason, at least at a personal level. And so faith protects us from this discouragement. Faith continues to guide us with the sure confidence that there is a clear path, that God has revealed himself and confirms for us a way to wisdom, and also invites us to contemplate issues that perhaps we would not be inclined to explore. Now, this is important here, that human reason can certainly reach the affirmation of the existence of one God. Again, this may surprise both believers and non-believers alike, that God is certainly believed in, but he can also be philosophically demonstrated. And you may be well aware that Thomas Aquinas begins this great summary of theology presenting these 5 key arguments, approaches, demonstrations of the existence of God. He brings forward an argument for the first mover, taking the experience in our universe of motion, understood not merely as locomotion, not merely as taking one object and transferring it to another place, but understanding motion in all of its senses. Understanding it, yes, as locomotion, understanding also qualitative change, quantitative change, and also substantial change of one substance or being that comes in existence after this deeper transformation. And so fundamentally, Thomas presents change here, motion here, as the shift from potency to actuality. He speaks of the reduction of potency to actuality. And so he recognizes that there must be some being already in act responsible for moving another from potency to actuality. And he contends that this necessity is true in each and every moment. So he's not merely bringing us in a series back throughout time to some sort of beginning moment at the start of history. No, rather he's saying in each and every moment, this series of movers requires some being who is able to actualize the potency in another. Some being who is not himself actualized, this pure act, this prime mover. Thomas goes on to make a similar case for efficient causality, that those things that are caused to be require some external cause because they can't cause themselves. And they are dependent upon that external cause. Again, not simply in a series that extends to some past moment in time, but in the here and now. There must be some uncaused causer, some being who does not receive existence, but is existence, and therefore in each and every moment can confer this gift of existence and realize, actualize all other dependent beings that are dependent on this being who is pure existence. Thomas makes a similar argument regarding contingency, those things that go in and out of being, that are capable of coming in and out of being, that these too are dependent ultimately on a necessary being who always was and always is, who is outside of this frailty of contingency. Thomas goes on to make a case based upon the various grades of perfection in the universe that point us toward the ultimate perfect being, the standard for all other perfection. Likewise, Thomas observes the order of even the non-rational creatures that tend to act always or almost always in a certain way according to their nature. And he perceives in that order an ultimate intelligence responsible for this finality found even in the non-rational world. Now, we could and should have an entire course on these various approaches to God, but I simply wanted to give you a brief summary, a brief reminder of the fact that Thomas Aquinas is convinced that God can be reached not only through religious faith, but through the gift of natural reason. And again, there is so much more to be said about Thomas's line of argument, and we can say so much more about various ways in which we should respond to some of the common objections against Thomas's approach. But again, it's simply a reminder that God can be reached through the gift of reason alone. But only faith which receives the divine revelation is able to draw from the mystery of love of the triune God. So here we see again this truth that faith is opening us up into something that we could not receive, that we could not attain by our own powers alone. So while these great ways or proofs of Thomas Aquinas and other thinkers do in fact bring us to a prime mover, to an uncaused cause, to a necessary being, to this perfect being who is the standard of all other perfection, to this intelligence that is the source of all finality that we find in the universe, this ultimate final cause. While reason brings us to conclude that this being is one, unchanging, eternal, all-powerful, intelligent, etc., while philosophy can tell us a lot about God, it can't invite us into the inner mystery of the triune God. It can't begin to speak of this eternal, mutual self-giving of the Trinity. It can't teach us about the divine revelation of the heart of Jesus Christ. This is a gift that we receive through divine revelation, that, again, we receive humbly because it is revealed by the one who can neither deceive nor be deceived. We have a great summary here of the three particular ways that Thomas sees faith and reason interacting. Here in the commentary on a great text, De Trinitate, a text on the Trinity, that the thinker Boethius wrote, Thomas goes on to show this relationship between faith and reason. And he says that first, reason is of great benefit and importance in the life of faith because of its capacity to demonstrate those truths that are preambles of the faith. The famous preambula fide that Thomas speaks of often. The most famous example of that, which we have touched on very briefly, would be the capacity of man to come to a philosophical knowledge of God, that he can conclude to this one eternal, unchanging, uncaused cause, prime mover, necessary being, etc. And so this can be of a great benefit, because if one considers that belief in God is absurd, then he most certainly will not consider any other claims that Christians make about their church or about the doctrines of the sacraments or other aspects of religious practice. Conviction in God is foundational. And if God seems absurd, well, all the rest crumbles. So Thomas acknowledges that these philosophical arguments can be of great benefit. Again, they can't constrain anyone to embrace the faith, but they can remove certain intellectual barriers or roadblocks to the acceptance of God. But in addition to these truths about the existence of God, Thomas also speaks of other preambles to the faith. He speaks, for instance, of the immortality of the soul, that we can, from a reflection on the nature of man, particularly starting from his various acts, his spiritual acts, such as intellectual abstraction, come to conclude that these spiritual acts must be grounded in a spiritual soul, and that this spiritual soul, while certainly in profound unity with man's body, is not intrinsically dependent upon it, and therefore can persist even after man's earthly death. So we have Thomas making a philosophical case not only for the existence of God, but also for the immortality of the soul, for the spirituality of man's soul. Thomas also alludes often in his work to the doctrine of the natural law, that man, through the gift of reason alone, can reflect on those goods that perfect his human nature. He can perfect on certain natural inclinations that indicate these goods that will bring him full flourishing in this life. In addition, Thomas argues that reason is important in the context of faith because it can help us to have a clearer notion, by similitudes, similarities, of the truths of the faith. So here Thomas is speaking very much of the work of the theologian. And the work of the theologian is, again, not simply to memorize passages of the Bible and to repeat them ad nauseum. No, rather, the work of the theologian is to enter into this great treasure of divine revelation and help others to better understand the various images and messages of this great library of the Bible, of these great treasures of divine revelation. So reason can be incredibly important to express in a clear and systematic way all of these great truths that are expressed in the rich diversity of literary forms throughout the Bible. Also, Thomas acknowledges an important role for reason in the context of faith in order to resist those who speak against the faith, either by showing that their statements are false or by showing that they are not necessarily true. So we see here again that Thomas was at times an apologist. Again, we talked about apology rooted in the passage from St. Peter, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. This giving of a defense to all of those who ask for the reason for the hope that is in us. But of course, with gentleness and reverence. not to humiliate others, not to demonstrate our own rational superiority, but to help them understand the truths or the reasonableness of what we profess. So here Thomas acknowledges the fact that throughout history, in his time, and most certainly in our own time today, there are many who attack the faith, who dismiss it as something absurd. We saw that Pinker, we saw that Dawkins have a concept of faith that goes against the evidence, a vision of faith and religion as something superstitious, as something childish, as something even a bit dangerous at times. So here Thomas thinks that reason can be employed to show that the arguments that are used against theology are imperfect, that they are false. Also, Thomas notes here that sometimes it could be simply a matter of showing that a particular argument is not definitive. So, again, to be clear, Thomas is not saying that reason alone can bring us to demonstrate all of the truths of religion. While we can come to this knowledge of the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, of certain principles of the natural law, we can never, through reason alone, demonstrate the truth of the Trinity. However, what we can do in this context of apologetic argument is show that any argument that proposes that these truths of the faith are somehow absurd or contrary to reason can itself be refuted. So, perhaps you have heard before some who tried to dismiss this doctrine of the Trinity as being absurd because we profess one God, yet we seem to be worshiping three, right? So it seems as though we're engaging in this polytheism while trying to maintain monotheism. And Thomas says that the work of the apologist here is to show that they have a misunderstanding, that there's perhaps a lack of philosophical sophistication. There's the lack of understanding of the distinction between nature and person. And so here the apologist is not called to show through philosophical argument that the Trinity is true, but he at least can show that these arguments against the Trinity are weak. Another key aspect for Thomas in this entire dialogue of faith and religion is the use of analogical language. And this is precisely what enables us to speak with our own weak, frail, and imperfect human words about the infinite, perfect God. So here in analogy, we're dealing with the use of the same term in two or more contexts, in which that term has a meaning that is both similar and different. So it is not completely different in the two contexts, as would be the case in equivocal language, nor is it exactly the same use in the two contexts as is the case in univocal language. Rather, the two terms are used, the one term is used with two meanings that are partially the same and partially different. So therefore, Thomas acknowledges that our own words can never exhaustively capture or show the full glory and splendor of the infinite God. However, that doesn't mean that we're doomed to utter ignorance and silence about God. Perhaps you've heard people use the term mystery. They say, well, that's a mystery. God is a mystery. The Trinity is a mystery. Which often enough means, well, if it's a mystery, then we better not talk about it, right? We'd better not go any deeper. We better not even try to think about it. But as the great theologian Frank Sheed observed, a mystery is not something that we can say nothing about. It's rather something that we cannot say everything about. So a mystery is not something we can say nothing about. Rather, it's something that we cannot say everything about. So Thomas is humble enough to recognize the limits of our language, but at the same time, he wants to defend our capacity to say something meaningful about God in our own language. Now, this doctrine of the analogy is of importance to this day, because often enough in contemporary atheism, religious language is considered meaningless. It's considered in a category, a subpar category. There's serious, meaningful language used in the natural sciences, whereas religion at best engages in sort of poetry about God and has a sort of subjective, emotional value, but can never purport to be something objectively, universally true for all men. And this is a fruit of a positivist thought. So the positivists will claim that really only that which can be measured, quantified, tested, and studied through but with the scientific method is of any real objective value. And again, that the rest is meaningless. And this brings us to a certain reductive perspective on reality, a certain scientism. Science is wonderful and great, and we'll see throughout this entire course the ways in which modern science has permitted us an understanding of the shroud that our ancestors could have never reached only a few hundred years ago. So we'll see the marvels of modern science, of photography, of botany, and other studies used in particular on the shroud to help our appreciation of its message. But scientism, positivism, exalts one form of human knowledge at the exclusion of many others, whether that be literature, religion, etc. Now, Thomas Aquinas is a man of faith. He's a man deeply interested in the power and role of divine grace. And so he sees again a continuity between nature and grace. So God's grace, the life of faith, the life of sanctity, does not come to destroy our human nature, does not come to transform us into a completely new person, someone that we're not, but rather grace presupposes and perfects our human nature, elevates our human nature, but again is always building upon it. Thomas and the entire Catholic tradition is clear that our nature is wounded by sin, but not totally depraved, not completely corrupt. That, again, we still have the gift of reason. We can still come to these wonderful truths about God, about the natural law, about our own nature. But we are inclined towards sin, and our intellect is weakened, is therefore at times prone to go astray. And this also helps us understand better why Thomas considers it fit and appropriate that God should, through his divine revelation, confirm many of the truths that we already mentioned reason alone can conclude to. For instance, regarding the existence of God. While it's true that we can come to this sure and certain knowledge of God, Thomas is also a realist. He realizes that many people simply do not have the time, do not have the leisure necessary to pursue a long period of philosophical studies necessary to understand the various metaphysical principles and concepts that frame and make up his clear arguments. He realizes that even the great thinkers, even those who are blessed with the time necessary to pursue this philosophical formation, are still prone to error, can still go astray. So Thomas says that it was fitting that God should confirm these truths, like the existence of God, like the truths of the natural law, or of our own immortality, through divine revelation, so that all men, not just the philosophers, all men might easily and without admixture of error come to a sure knowledge of these truths that are foundational to understand who we are and where we're meant to go. So again, we see Thomas as a great optimist in reason, in that he exalts its value, its role, and even its capacities apart from divine revelation. But at the same time, he's also a realist, and he knows that with the effects of sin, with the limits of time and knowledge, many of us would not be able to come to that sure and certain knowledge that we need to organize our lives and understand our purpose in this world. So we see that grace heals, strengthens, and assists us in pursuing this happiness, in not only reflecting upon this prime mover, not only reflecting upon the uncaused cause, but coming to a relationship with him and coming through a life of virtue to full flourishing in the life of grace. And here all of the faculties of man are purified, transformed, and uplifted. So we see that grace is not here to replace or do away or alter or deny that which we have received as human beings, but rather we're called to full human flourishing, where all aspects and faculties are brought to completion and harmony. Now, we see that divine grace, therefore, impels us into this rich moral life with ethical commitments, that the truths of divine revelation aren't simply revealed so that to satisfy our own curiosity or so that we know a bit more about the world or a bit more information about God. No, divine revelation in the life of grace is not only informative, it's transformative. And so it invites us into this new way of life. Now, Thomas, at the same time, while acknowledging that the life of grace alone will bring us to this full flourishing in this world that prepares us best for happiness in the next, he also acknowledges that all human beings, believers and non-believers alike, are called to recognize the needs of human nature expressed in the natural law and to draw inspiration from it in the formulation of positive laws. Now, this is important because it provides a solid foundation for dialogue. We all know how pluralistic and diverse contemporary societies are. It's rare to find a nation that ascribes to only one particular perspective. Rather, we're used to interacting on a daily basis with people from different religions, or perhaps with no religion at all. But Thomas does not give into despair over this situation. He knows that while we might not share everything, we still do share a common human nature. And therefore, we have been made, designed, oriented toward particular goods that will contribute to our flourishing. And he's convinced that reason, reflecting on this human nature and reflecting on these human goods, can bring us to common ground and can bring us to establish certain laws that will best contribute and be most conducive to this flourishing. And Thomas thinks that natural law is important in our framing of positive law, in our framing of the laws unique to a particular nation or people. Now, this perspective brings great freedom. And in fact, it brings us, you could say, grounds for being revolutionaries. This is a theme that's dear to the philosopher Peter Kraft. He says that many times we think of natural law thinking as an outdated traditional approach, whereas in fact it gives grounds for revolution. Because only a conviction in a universal human nature will ultimately enable us to acknowledge these universal human rights. And only a conviction rooted in the natural law of this higher law that transcends all other particular man-made laws allows us to point to unjust laws and say, well, this may be the law of the land, but it is not right. It is not correct. It is a violation of human nature. It goes against human goods. It is a violation of human rights. And therefore, this sense of the natural law allows us to be revolutionaries, to respect the legitimate laws of our land, but to stand up when necessary to call out any abuses against human rights. And this also helps us to appreciate the fact that ethical relativism is not the proper grounds for democracy. Ethical relativism is not the way in which we can best respect the clear diversity and pluralism in our society. Rather, it all too often leads to a totalitarianism. Because if there is no higher law to appeal to, if there is no higher standard based upon universal human nature and universal human rights, then in the end, we're bound to follow those in power. And those few who are in power will dictate to us what is correct and what is not. And therefore will enter into this totalitarian system, whether it be explicit and violent, or whether it be more or less a soft totalitarianism without clear violence. There will still be the rule of the few and the powerful over the many who are weak. So again, this defense of universal human rights, which thankfully is so often talked about and practiced and pursued throughout the world, finds its ultimate foundation in this vision of the natural law, of which Thomas Aquinas is one of the leading proponents. Pope Benedict XVI, in returning to the great thought of Thomas Aquinas, returns to a theme that's dear to him, which is a broadened concept of human reason, to a concept of human reason that is not reduced to the empirical or scientific. As we spoke of earlier, science is wonderful. Science contributes to our capacity to make these videos, to so many elements of our shroud studies. But it does not answer all of man's questions. And an appreciation for science should not restrict us to the limits of the quantifiable, of that which can be measured, at the expense of allowing us to raise these fundamental questions that have haunted and have interest all men. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? How should I live my life? What, if anything, is waiting for me after the grave? These are important questions that no lab test can answer for us. Also, the Pope exhorts us, following the example of Thomas Aquinas, through this harmony of faith and reason, to embrace a broad and confident reason, aware that this faith-inspired reason will enable us to tackle all of the major questions and difficulties of the day, and that will allow us to apply these unchanging truths to all of the changing circumstances and difficulties that we face today. So, before concluding, I first wanted to thank you for your time and attention. And I know that some of the aspects of this talk, of these two videos today, may have seemed a bit abstract, a little bit detached from the shroud studies that you have chosen so wisely to pursue through this series. But I trust that as you enter into the more particular issues, you'll quickly come to see the importance and beauty of reconciling all of the great insights that the natural sciences can bring us with the truths of your faith. And you'll also be able to better appreciate the distinction between the two. You'll see that there are certain truths or conclusions that you may come to in your shroud studies that are not dogmas of the faith, that good Christians may disagree about, but which can perhaps help you to better understand what you know through divine revelation. So I pray that as you study this fascinating theme of the shroud, you're constantly aware of the distinction between what is proper to reason, the natural sciences, philosophy, and what is proper to theology, to the gift of revelation. But at the same time, you're able in your personal life, in your thought, and with those around you, to witness and share the profound harmony between the two, Because in the end, as we know, faith and reason stem from the same God, from the same Logos, from the same intelligent God who has chosen to invite us to understand the universe and Him in these two forms of knowledge. And I thought it fitting to conclude our work with a prayer from Thomas Aquinas, this great saint who so well modeled the harmony between faith and reason. Grant me, O Lord my God, a mind to know you, a heart to seek you, wisdom to find you, conduct pleasing to you, faithful perseverance in waiting for you, and a hope of finally embracing you. Amen. Thank you.